My name is Joe Marsella, and I commit to you to provide the shortest presentation on the panel today. I hesitate to admit, but I recently watched the movie Divergent on a plane. My excuse is after many, many hours on a plane, you start to run out of movies to watch. But the premise of the movie I found interesting, the idea that we could segment the population into different factions of beliefs based on personalities, and that would somehow lead to a more utopian society, a betterment of society, somehow made me think of the SDN. The idea that all these different beliefs actually lead to a more utopian internet, and some people would argue even a better society based on that. It was something I couldn't help but exploit here. But based on that, in my experience in travels around the world the last few years, I tend to look at the SDN market into three different themes, or you can typically divide people's opinions and mindsets into sort of three different categories. Arguably, these are a bit vague, and you can move from category to category, but at the end of the day, I think people tend to resonate their companies in one of these categories. On one side, there's the purist view, the idea that, as we've talked about numerous times, that we can separate the data planes and control planes, and this will relate to a whole wide range of different values in the network. The idea originated in Stanford, it's carried on in the ONF. We're seeing examples of that to the extent you can say there's momentum growing in SDN. There's clearly a lot of momentum growing in a purist model. But the idea that this requires pretty radical changes in network architecture it leads to skepticism in some people. Some of it we've heard today in previous conversations, but this leads to somewhat of a pragmatic view. So when you start to look at different mindsets in the SDN community, this idea of pragmatic view looks at a lot of the value propositions that the purists are talking about and says, I can achieve a lot of these same values without a radical re-architecture of the network. So, do I need to separate data planes and control planes? Do I need to actually use OpenFlow? Do I need to actually do a lot of these more stringent, radically shifting designs to the architecture to achieve these benefits? And they would argue you probably don't. If I can get to a more programmable interface to a control layer through more simple technologies like REST APIs, for example, then I can open up an ecosystem that lots of different application vendors can start to realize some of these benefits. These applications can drive revenue, they can lower CapEx, they can address OpEx issues, but the idea that we can leverage this in more of a shorter term step than a radical revolution is something that pragmatists hold on to. The third category, I think, is an interesting one, primarily because it comes from more of a network operations side of things. These guys, all they're looking for is a very simple idea that finally solved the 10-year-old, 20-year-old problem of multi-vendor management. Their holy grail is to be able to provision an end-to-end service across a multi-vendor network. God forbid we can actually see a map with multi-vendors in one space. We can see an ARM list that even has correlation across the vendor community. The idea is fairly simple, but it creates an interesting dilemma. And where does the world of SDN begin and the world of management end? And this leads to discussions that I think are fascinating around, what is an SDN controller versus a multi-vendor management system? How do you divide these things? What does the Venn diagram look like? How do we get from one world to the other? Are they two separate systems, the same system? We could go on there, but the idea that this system is really more of an operational focused viewpoint is something that I think is pretty relevant out there in the industry today. The second interesting thing to talk about when we talk about the state of the SDN is really the playing field. And I tend to look at the playing field as almost becoming all-encompassing. But you can look at sort of four key areas when you talk about how this has grown. SDN started in specific pockets around the different areas. But when we start to look at sort of functions, so the idea that we can point to specific use cases within the data center, arguably we've got both pragmatist and purist implementations that exist today, but this is evolving into the wireless, for example, through things like service chaining, but not stopping there, going to things like radio, going to things like backhaul, extending into the wide area network. We're even seeing now examples of wide area network convergence with data centers. So example of partnerships that you can see out there in the market of data center companies and WAN companies providing sort of end-to-end virtual connections between the data centers for large virtual machine transfers. The second piece, I think, is around the market itself, sometimes called the market verticals. Arguably SDN began in the R&E community. It moved very quickly into the content delivery space. There's very high profile examples of that exist out there today. But recently, we've seen a lot of push into service provider space, into the MSO or cable space, into the government space. We're even seeing SDN now show up in the submarine space, which has historically sort of lagged the industry in terms of innovation, at least at the higher layers. Examples of we've got all this high capacity submarine links underneath the ocean. How do we better leverage that to create more dynamic connectivity based on demand versus just nailed up static capability? So it's really sort of starting to bring together a wide range of markets. The third area is an area that I call horizontal, or sort of driving from the edge of the network more into the core of the network, or said otherwise, from the access to the metro to the core. I would argue that SDN concepts are more easily adopted sort of at the edge of the network, where the scale of the switches isn't as extreme as it would be in the core of the network. So we feel more comfortable with leveraging sort of SDN technologies on smaller boxes than we do on very large boxes. So this idea that we're starting to move a little bit closer to the metro, and ultimately we start living in the core. Another way to look at it is we start to see more purist implementations at the edge and start to see more pragmatist implementations in the core. But that shift will continue. The final area, we touched on this a little bit this morning, I guess, was the idea of what I call vertical, or really the layers of the OSI stack. And I actually agree with the sentiment this morning that this over time will break down, and the ideas of all these different levels start to blend together. But the reality of the situation is today is we still design networks in different layers. And arguably SDN sort of began in the packet domain, more specifically in the layer 3 domain, but I think we're starting to see examples now in layer 2, layer 1, layer 0 based domains all the way down to the photonic layer. In fact, as we speak today, the OIF is doing a multi-vendor interop at layer 0 at different carriers around the world. That's going to be presented later in October. So this idea that even once we have this view of SDN or more programmable capabilities at these individual layers, we can then start seeing even across the layers and doing more intelligent things that, the simple example is just sharing risk group information from the lower layers to the higher layers, but that can lead to even more radical shifts around multi-layer optimization and multi-layer control. The third area is once we have this new expanded playing field, we can start to see different battle lines being drawn in the sand, or different divergent thoughts, if you will, in architecture, both from a vendor perspective, but also from a provider or network operator perspective. On the vendor side, I think it's going to create a shift in what we traditionally viewed as our competitors. Router vendors compete with router vendors, transport vendors compete with transport vendors, and so on down the line. But as we go forward and the world becomes sort of more software-centric, I think these lines start to divide, and we start to see non-traditional companies competing with each other. We start to see software-specific companies emerge, and the overall sort of competitive landscape starts to change. This represents a very interesting opportunity for vendors, but it also represents a sort of threat as other people move into what was traditionally their home turf. The second sort of piece from a vendor side is this idea of a pure versus hybrid architecture. Almost said another way, it's the purist view versus the pragmatist view. Which viewed is the vendor pitch to the market? Which solution sets do they bring to the market? I think this has an interesting opportunity to create divisions in different vendor philosophies. And then the third piece was touched on a little bit earlier, is this idea of the way we bring about this solution. The two big things that come to mind to me are the idea of open source software. Do we base our solution sets on open source, or do we do more customized solutions in-house? I think arguably today everybody uses pieces of open source, but how heavily is that solution based on open source? How do we differentiate if we use open source? How do we keep from that specific community trying to solve all problems to all people and actually solve very specific pieces? The alternative to that is to develop it all yourself, and that solves a lot of those problems, but it also brings other problems in terms of leveraging economies of scale, and how do you compete with these open source communities and all those types of things. The second piece, which was just talked about, is the idea versus white box versus specialized hardware, right? Even gray boxes, if you will. Which is the right approach? Certain vendors will go one way, certain vendors will go the other way, but I think that's another battle line that'll be drawn over the coming months. On the service provider side, I think the competitive thing is equally there. The idea that service providers competed with service providers is now starting to break down, and that we're seeing MSOs compete with service providers. We're seeing CDN companies compete with everybody. This whole lower cost of entry, or barriers of entry, has come way down, and we're starting to see more and more overlap in terms of markets, or vertical markets. Business model is another interesting one. So do you focus largely on sort of the revenue side of things and generation of new services, or do you focus largely on more of a CapEx, OpEx focus of revenue reduction? And I was at a customer last week and they said, all we care about is cost reduction and resiliency. But I've been in other customers where their focus is largely on service innovation and driving new services to market. What is the approach in the community? That's going to be a division line as well. And then finally, this transformation strategy. Do you become a market leader or do you become a follower? What's been interesting to me is companies we've typically looked at as market leaders have, in a new technology shift, they're actually reverting to sort of a follower mode, and companies that used to be followers are reverting to more of a leadership role, and how will that play out in the end of the game? It's an interesting scenario to watch as we go forward. Oh, sorry, I'm almost done here. I lied, I guess. So in conclusion, in my perspective, the state of SDN, I mean, the belief systems are more or less in place. Arguably, there's divergence in any belief systems, and unlike the movie, we won't be killing people that don't believe in a certain system. The playing field, I think, is greatly expanded, and the battlefield lines are been drawn in the sand. So to the extent that SDN is an inflection point or arguably a revolution, then the revolution has begun. Thank you.